Near the end of 1889, the Irish Home Rule movement, which for years had fought to bring about self-government for Ireland, which was still a part of the United Kingdom, was sundered by the revelation of a cuckolded husband. The ensuing sex scandal centered on the leader of the movement in Parliament, Charles Stuart Parnell, known to many as the uncrowned King of Ireland. Parnell was a Protestant, Anglo-Irish aristocrat from County Wicklow, who rose to become president of the newly formed Irish Home Rule League Party in 1880. Eschewing violence, Parnell advocated a strategy of using parliamentary reform to achieving Irish self-rule, despite being jailed for a time by the British. In 1882, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, Lord Frederick Cavendish, and his Undersecretary, Thomas Henry Burke, were stabbed to death in Phoenix Park in Dublin. The assassinations were carried out by a group calling themselves the Invincibles, a splinter group of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Parnell used the murders to distance his movement from the more radical IRB, and entered into a partnership with the British Liberal Prime Minister, William Gladstone, to create a Home Rule Bill to be voted on in Parliament, though it ultimately failed to pass. He declared in 1885, "No man has the right to fix the boundary of a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, 'Thus far shalt thou go, and no further.'" Parnell's movement was constitutional, nonviolent, and embraced both Catholics and Protestants. He seemed the only man capable of bringing about home rule, until his untimely fall from grace. In 1889, Captain William O'Shea filed for divorce from his wife, Catherine "Kitty" O'Shea. He named in the suit, as co-respondent, none other than Parnell himself. It was soon revealed that Parnell and Kitty had been lovers for years, and that he had actually fathered her 3 children. Overnight, Parnell's support among the liberals of Victorian England and the Catholic Church in Ireland evaporated. Parnell, however, refused to step down, and in November of 1890, the party split, with 2/3 rejecting his leadership. Despite his failing health, he fought to regain control of the party until, on October 6, 1891, with Kitty, then his wife, by his side, he died. Parnell's death ended any hope of achieving home rule through parliamentary means, and many would soon turn to armed revolt. Accompanying the new nationalism would be a renewed interest in Irish language and culture. As for those who refused to break with Parnell, on the anniversary of his death, they would wear a leaf of ivy, an evergreen plant and symbol of fidelity, in his memory. One who remained loyal to Parnell for the rest of his days was John Stanislaw Joyce, who would pass his admiration of Parnell onto his oldest surviving son, who at the age of 9 wrote a broadside poem, Et tu, Healy? An attack on the betrayers of Parnell, and in particular, his treacherous lieutenant, Tim Healy. His quaint perch, airy on the crags of time, where the rude din of this century can trouble him no more. Years later, that same son would write of the Irish Parliamentary Party, "They have given proof of their compassion only in 1891, when they sold their leader Parnell to the pharisaical conscience of the English dissenters without extracting the 30 pieces of silver." For James Augustine Aloysius Joyce, the figure of Parnell would attain mythic significance. Ireland's betrayed hero, whose death condemned it to the violent upheavals of the 20th century. References to Parnell abound in all his major works, including his most famous novel, Ulysses. James Joyce was born in the suburbs outside Dublin on February 2nd, 1882, the second child of 13. His family belonged to the rising Catholic middle class in Dublin, and at first they prospered, able to afford household servants, and to send young James to Jesuit-run schools. Both of his parents were musically inclined, often singing popular Victorian ballads and opera extracts in the home, many of which would find their way into Joyce's fiction. His father, John, would be the model for the characters of Simon Dedalus and Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker. An early memory of his father reading him a nursery rhyme is recorded in Joyce's semi-autobiographical novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road. And this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice-ins little boy named Baby Tuckoo. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. He was a baby Tuckoo. Their fortunes dried up, however, with the downfall of Parnell and the end of the political patronage that helped sustain his father, who soon turned to drink as the family was forced to move out of the suburbs and into the slums of the north inner city. Joyce's early Catholicism would play a large role in his later fiction. Engrossed in the ritual and theology of the faith, he even considered a vocation as a priest, but found that while the spirit was willing, the flesh was weak. In his early teens, he began experimenting with prostitutes in Dublin's red light district, or Night Town, as he refers to it in Ulysses. Joyce's frank discussion of human sexuality in his writings would often push the boundaries of realist fiction and put him at odds with the censor. Ultimately, Joyce rejected the faith of his youth for one of his own making. He would worship art itself, and taking up the vocation of an artist, he would become a priest of that religion. Joyce's work often depicts everyday life and does not shy away from the bodily functions that accompany it. Part of Joyce's genius is his ability to take the mundane and imbue it with a greater significance. Joyce often referred to his technique as epiclete, from the Greek epiklesis, which in the Eastern Church refers to the invocation of the Holy Spirit for the consecration of the Eucharistic bread and wine, which become the body and blood of Christ. He wrote to his brother, "Don't you think there is a certain resemblance between the mystery of the Mass and what I'm trying to do? To give people some kind of intellectual pleasure or spiritual enjoyment by converting the bread of everyday life into something that has permanent artistic life of its own." Never one to shy away from controversy, Joyce opens the novel with a mocking and blasphemous parody of the Tridentine Mass. Here we find Buck Mulligan. Rather than imitatio Christi, he instead impishly imitates a priest performing Mass. Stately, plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead, bearing a bowl of lather in which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. A yellow dressing gown, ungirdled, was sustained gently behind him in the mild morning air. He held the bowl aloft and intoned, "In troibo ad altare Dei." Halted, he peered down the dark, winding stairs and called up coarsely, "Come up, Kinch! Come up, you fearful Jesuit!" Solemnly he came forward and mounted the gun rest. He faced about and blessed gravely thrice the tower, the surrounding country, and the awaking mountains. Then, catching sight of Stephen Dedalus, he bent towards him and made rapid crosses in the air, gurgling in his throat and shaking his head. Stephen Dedalus, displeased and sleepy, leaned his arms on top of the staircase and looked coldly at the shaking, gurgling face that blessed him, equine in its length, and at the light, untonsured hair, grained and hued like pale oak. In 1902, Joyce left Dublin for Paris to study medicine, but quickly gave it up to seek literary fame. He was soon in debt, cold, and hungry, often relying on money orders from his mother Mary to feed himself. On Good Friday, April 10th, 1903, he received a telegram that would be reproduced in Ulysses. "Mother dying. Come home. Father." Joyce tended to his mother as she was slowly dying of cancer, and despite her pleas to him, he refused to take communion or make confession. She died on August 13th, and Joyce, though he never regretted his decision, felt guilt over his refusals for the rest of his life. On June 10th, 1904, while walking down Nassau Street in Dublin, Joyce met and fell in love with a girl from Galway, working as a chambermaid in nearby Finn's Hotel. Her name was Nora Barnacle. She later recalled, "I mistook him for a Swedish sailor, his electric blue eyes, yachting cap, and plimsolls. But when he spoke, well then, I knew him at once for just another Dublin jackeen chatting up a country girl." Despite her first impression, Joyce was persistent and eventually convinced her to go on a date with him, walking along the beach near Sandymount and concluding the evening with an onanistic sex act. Joyce would commemorate that date, June 16, 1904, by setting the events of the novel Ulysses on that same day. When Joyce told his father about Nora Barnacle, John said, "She'll stick to you." Unsurprisingly, the two lovers soon eloped to the continent, where they would remain for 35 years. They were married in 1931 and had 2 children together, a son and a daughter. Nora would be Joyce's muse, and the love letters he wrote to her, both passionate and flatulent, speak to her importance in his life as an artist. When the 20-year-old James Joyce met the Irish poet William Butler Yeats in 1902, he asked him, "How old are you?" Yeats replied, 36, though he was actually 37 at the time. Joyce replied, "I thought as much. I've met you too late. You're too old for me to help you." Yeats later told his friends, "Such a colossal self-conceit with such a Lilliputian literary genius I never saw combined in one person." Despite Joyce's bravado, he quickly realized after publishing his first collection of poetry, Chamber Music, that he would not best Yeats as a poet. Instead, he turned to prose, writing a collection of short stories entitled Dubliners, where he introduced the city of Dublin, serving not only as a location, but a recurring character with mythic significance that appears throughout Joyce's fiction. After mastering the short story, he wrote his first great novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. The work, semi-autobiographical, centered around the spiritual and artistic awakening of Joyce's literary alter ego, Stephen Dedalus. The name Stephen invokes the first Christian martyr, Saint Stephen, and Joyce would often imagine himself as a betrayed artist or lover. In much the same vein as Parnell, Dedalus suggested the great craftsman of Greek mythology, who created the labyrinth on Crete, just as Joyce would craft labyrinths of words. As he said of Ulysses, "I've put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries arguing over what I meant, and that's the only way of ensuring one's immortality." In a famous scene set during a Christmas dinner, Joyce depicts guests arguing about the political split over Parnell's infidelity, with a fire and brimstone aunt, appropriately mispronounced Dante, condemning Parnell, and a Mr. Casey condemning those who betrayed him. "God and religion before everything," Dante cried. "God and religion before the world." Mr. Casey raised his clenched fist and brought it down on the table with a crash. "Very well then," he shouted hoarsely. "If it comes to that, no God for Ireland." "John, John," cried Mr. Dedalus, seizing his guest by the coat sleeve. Dante stared across the table, her cheeks shaking. Mr. Casey struggled up from his chair and bent across the table towards her, scraping the air from before his eyes with one hand as though he were tearing aside a cobweb. "No God for Ireland," he cried. "We have had too much God in Ireland. Away with God." "Blasphemer! Devil!" screamed Dante, starting to her feet and almost spitting in his face. Uncle Charles and Mr. Dedalus pulled Mr. Casey back into his chair again, talking to him from both sides reasonably. He stared before him out of his dark, flaming eyes, repeating, "Away with God, I say." Dante shoved her chair violently aside and left the table, upsetting her napkin ring, which rolled slowly along the carpet and came to rest against the foot of an easy chair. Mrs. Dedalus rose quickly and followed her towards the door. At the door, Dante turned around violently and shouted down the room, her cheeks flushed with quivering rage. "Devil out of hell! We won! We crushed him to death! Fiend!" The door slammed behind her. Mr. Casey, freeing his arms from his holders, suddenly bowed his head on his hands with a sob of pain. "Poor Parnell," he cried loudly. "My dead king." He sobbed loudly and bitterly. Stephen, raising his terror-stricken face, saw that his father's eyes were full of tears. James Joyce considered Odysseus the most rounded character in fiction, and explained why he thought so to his painter friend, Frank Budgeon. Ulysses is son to Laertes, but he is a father to Telemachus, husband to Penelope, lover of Calypso, companion in arms to the Greek warriors around Troy, and king of Ithaca. He was subjected to many trials, but with wisdom and courage came through them all. Instead of a warrior king, Joyce cast as the protagonist of his epic, the mild-mannered Leopold Bloom. Though Bloom may appear to be unheroic, even comic figure, for Joyce he was the perfect antidote to the false notions of heroism that had led Europe's youth to the slaughter of the Great War. Ulysses is not just a prose epic of the modern world, it is also a pacifist novel, as illustrated by Bloom in Barney Kiernan's pub. Force, hatred, history, all that. That's not life for men and women, insult and hatred, and everybody knows that it's the very opposite of that is really life. Love, the opposite of hatred. The war forced Joyce and his family, who were living in Trieste when it broke out, to move to Zurich in neutral Switzerland. In Tom Stoppard's play, Travesties, a haughty British official asks James Joyce, "What did you do in the Great War, Mr. Joyce?" He replies, "I wrote Ulysses. What did you do?" Joyce's hero is also of Jewish extraction, making him something of an outsider even in his own country. As he explained to the Italian critic, Carlo Lanati, "It is an epic of two races, Israelite and Irish. At the same time, the cycle of the human body, as well as a little story of a day, life. The character of Ulysses always fascinated me, even when a boy. Imagine, 15 years ago I started writing it as a story for Dubliners. For 7 years I have been working at this book. Blast it. It is also a sort of encyclopedia. My intention is to transpose the myth subspecie temporis nostral. Every adventure, that is, every hour, every organ, every art being interconnected and interrelated in the structural scheme of the whole, should not only condition, but even create its own technique. Each adventure is, so to say, one person, although it is composed of persons, as Aquinas relates of the angelic hosts. No English printer wanted to print a word of it. In America, the review was suppressed 4 times. Now, as I hear, a great movement is being prepared against the publication, initiated by Puritans, English imperialists, Irish Republicans, Catholics. What an alliance! Gosh, I ought to be given the Nobel Prize for Peace." The book is set in a single day, June 16, 1904, the anniversary of Joyce's date with Nora. It follows Bloom, whose activities around Dublin parallel the adventures of Odysseus in the Odyssey. Bloom's wife, Molly, is likened to Penelope, with one glaring difference. The Penelope of Homer is chaste until the return of her husband from Troy, whereas Molly has been having an affair with Blazes Boylan. Molly's Spanish heritage also connects her to Kitty O'Shea, the lover and wife of Parnell. Bloom is perfectly aware of the affair, and, in a sense, he consents to it. He and his wife have been married for 16 years, but they have not made love in over a decade, after the death of their infant son, Rudy. Stephen Dedalus returns to play the part of Telemachus, who searches for news of his lost father Odysseus. Stephen, who is haunted by the ghost of his mother and estranged from his father, will meet Bloom later in the novel and share with him a brief bond that echoes father and son. Many of the episodes in Ulysses were inspired by real events in Joyce's life. The famous opening chapter, Telemachus, takes place in a Martello Tower, a fortification built in the early 1800s to resist a Napoleonic invasion that never materialized. The inspiration for Buck Mulligan was a medical student Joyce had become friendly with, named Oliver St. John Gogarty. For a few days in September of 1904, Joyce and Gogarty stayed in a Martello Tower in Sandy Cove that Gogarty had rented for the purposes of turning it into an artist colony. The friendship soon soured, however, and one night an Anglo-Irishman named Samuel Trench, who was living in the tower, woke up after having a nightmare about a Black Panther and fired a revolver into the fireplace near Joyce's head. When he awoke again from a similar nightmare, Gogarty took the pistol and shouted, "Leave him to me," and fired the pistol at the pans hanging above Joyce's head. After this, Joyce wisely packed his things and left in the middle of the night, never to return. The character of Leopold Bloom was also inspired by a friend of Joyce's. In the summer of 1904, an inebriated Joyce had approached a young woman whose boyfriend was more than ready to defend her honor. But luckily, he was rescued from the encounter by a man named Alfred Hunter. Like Bloom, Hunter was said to be Jewish and have an unfaithful wife. When Stephen Dedalus is rescued by Bloom in Chapter 12, he takes the young man to his address, number 7 Eckley Street. Even the address has a real-life basis. In 1909, on a visit to Dublin, Joyce was told by a Vincent Cosgrave that Nora had been having an affair with him in 1904. Joyce despaired and sought the help of an old friend, J.F. Byrne, who assured Joyce that while Cosgrave had tried to seduce Nora, she had rejected him. Byrne's Dublin address was 7 Eckley Street. James Joyce is typically associated with modernism, an artistic movement that arose as a response to the changes wrought by modernization, urbanization, and industrialization. The outlook of the modernist was often pessimistic, and in the field of letters, many lamented the rise of a mass readership, the direct result of public education reforms. In fact, it was not uncommon among the intellectual classes to have outright contempt for what they dubbed the masses. As Thomas Hardy wrote in 1887, "You may regard a throng of people as containing a certain small minority who have sensitive souls, these and the aspects of these being what is worth observing. So you divide them into the mentally unquickened, mechanical, soulless, and the living, throbbing, suffering, vital, in other words, into souls and machines, ether and clay." And in The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot drew association between the crowds of office workers swarming across London Bridge with the damned in Dante's Inferno. A crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. One way that modernists responded to the masses, with their desire for adventure novels and newspapers, was to write difficult works that would require a minimum amount of higher education to even be comprehended. This led to the development of new literary techniques, such as stream of consciousness, which we can see in Ulysses in the chapter Lystragonians. Bloom is having a lunch of gorgonzola cheese with burgundy wine in David Burns' pub at 1 p.m., and is reminded of the first time he made love to his wife Molly on Houthead Bay. Memory is framed by two flies buzzing together on the wall of the pub. Stuck on the pane, two flies buzzed, stuck. Glowing wine on his palate, lingered, swallowed. Crushing in the wine press, grapes of Burgundy. Sun's heat it is. Seems to a secret touch, telling me, memory. Touched his sense, moistened, remembered. Hidden under wild ferns on Howth. Below us bay, sleeping sky, no sound. the sky. The bay purple by the Lion's Head, green by Drumlick, yellow-green toward Sutton, fields of undersea, the lines faint brown in grass, buried cities. Pillowed on my coat she had her hair, earwigs, and the heather scrubbed my hand under her nape. You'll toss me all. I wonder. Cool soft with ointments her hand touched me, caressed. Her eyes upon me did not turn away. Ravished over her I lay, full lips full open, kissed her mouth. Yum. Softly she gave me in my mouth, and the seed cake warm and chewed. Mawkish pulp, her mouth had mumbled sweet and sour with spittle. Joy. I ate it. Joy. Young life, her lips that gave me pouting. Soft, warm, sticky, gum jelly lips. Flowers her eyes were. Take me, willing eyes. Pebbles fell. She lay still. A goat. No one. High on Ben Houth, rhododendrons, a nanny goat, walking sure-footed, dropping currants. Screened under ferns, she laughed warm-folded. Wildly I lay on her, kissed her. Eyes, her lips, her stretched neck beating. Woman's breast full in her blouse of nun's veiling. Fat nipples upright. Hot I tongued her. She kissed me. I was kissed. All yielding she tossed my hair. Kissed. She kissed me. Me. And me now. Stuck. The flies buzzed. Joyce, however, stands out among the modernists, as the exception that proves the rule. His contemporary, Yeats, embraced eugenics, and insisted that the intellectuals would have to check the growth of the population. It will become the duty of the educated classes to seize and control one or more of these necessities. The drilled and docile masses may submit, but a prolonged civil war seems more likely, with the victory of the skillful riding their machines, as did the feudal knights their armored horses. Joyce, by contrast, did not share this contempt for the majority of humanity, and even makes his hero, Leopold Bloom, a middle-class ad salesman. Perhaps it was due to his upbringing in the city of Dublin, which was not an imperial metropole, but arguably still the imperial subject of the United Kingdom. It is telling that Virginia Woolf described Ulysses as an illiterate, underbred book, the product of a self-taught working man, and we all know how distressing they are, how egotistic, insistent, raw, striking, and ultimately nauseating. I'm reminded all the time of some callow board school boy. Despite this, Ulysses is still a modernist novel, perhaps the modernist novel. The irony of casting the everyman Leopold Bloom as its protagonist is that while we come to know him more intimately than any other character in the novel, it's doubtful that he could read his own book. Chapter 9 of Ulysses opens with an unnamed narrator describing a near accident with a chimney sweep, which signals to the reader that this chapter will represent the blinding of Polyphemus. I was just passing the time of day with old Troy of the DMP at the corner of Arbor Hill there. Be damned, but a bloody sweep came along, and he near drove his gear into my eye. The nameless eye then relates an incident that had occurred in Barney Kiernan's pub, which functions as the cave of the Cyclops. The one-eyed giant is translated into an anti-Semitic Athenian nationalist, hanging around the pub and hopes that someone will come buy him and his friend a drink. In Homer's Odyssey, it is expected that guests are to be given gifts by their hosts, and that the generosity shown is to be repaid in the future. In the pubs of Dublin, the custom is to buy a round of drinks with the expectation that those who imbibe will return the favor. When Bloom arrives at the pub, he lights a cigar and refuses to have a drink, as he does not want to be obligated to pay for a round himself. His lit cigar suggests the red-hot steak that blinds the Cyclops. The citizen and his friends become bitter, as they think Bloom has won money and is refusing to be generous with it. They begin to taunt Bloom for his Jewishness, to which he replies, "Your God was a Jew. Christ was a Jew like me." The citizen made a plunge back into the shop. "By Jesus," says he, "I'll brain that bloody Jew man for using the holy name. By Jesus, I'll crucify him, so I will. Give us that biscuit box there." Instead of a boulder, Joyce's Cyclops throws a biscuit box at Bloom, who escapes on a passing car. Throughout this episode, the narrative is interrupted by parodies that comment on the action of the scene in various literary styles, such as court proceedings, mythological fantasies, and biblical passages. For example, when Bloom escapes, is described as a parody of the prophet Elijah's fiery chariot ride into heaven. When, lo, there came about them all a great brightness, and they beheld the chariot wherein he stood ascend to heaven. They beheld him in the chariot, clothed upon the glory of the brightness, having raiment as of the sun, fair as the moon, and terrible, that for awe they durst not look upon him. And there came a voice out of heaven, calling, Elijah, I, Elijah. And he answered with a main cry, Abba, Adonai. And they beheld him, even him, Ben Bloom Elijah, amid clouds of angels, ascend to the glory of the brightness at an angle of 45 degrees, over Donahoe's in Little Green Street, like a shot off a shovel. Frank Budgeon drew a parallel between these interruptions and the new Cubist style of painting. Every event is a many-sided object. You first state one view of it, and then you draw it from another angle to another scale, and both aspects lie side by side in the same picture. We can see further connections with the Odyssey in other chapters of Ulysses. In Hades, Bloom attends the funeral of a friend and is reminded of the death of his son Rudy, as well as his father's suicide. He encounters Stephen along the way. Stephen and Bloom echo one another, just as they echo characters throughout the Western canon. Besides the king and prince of Ithaca, both also draw inspiration from the Prince of Denmark. Another exile troubled by the death of a parent, Hamlet, not unlike Bloom, is haunted by the visage of his dead father, though for Hamlet more literally so. Stephen, leaning against the gun rest of the Martello Tower, invokes Hamlet, who encounters the ghost of his father atop a tower as well. Both feel guilt for turning away from the religion of their parents. Stephen, his mother's Catholicism, Bloom, his father's Judaism. The chapter serves as a memento mori and parallels Odysseus' journey into the underworld. In Nausicaa, modeled after the writing style of Victorian romance novels, Bloom observes a teenage girl on the beach named Gertie McDowell, and they become aware of one another's attention. They both masturbate to completion. This episode parallels the encounter between a naked and shipwrecked Odysseus and the Phaeacian princess Nausicaa, provides him with help getting home, despite clearly being smitten with him. The chapter entitled Circe is set around midnight in Dublin's night town, where Bloom finds and offers help to a drunken Stephen Dedalus, who has been wandering among the brothels. This episode, which features hallucinatory images, parallels the episode of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus' crew are enchanted by the witch Circe and turned into pigs. After the end of the war, Joyce returned to Trieste and ultimately settled in Paris in June of 1920. He would remain there until World War II forced him to return to Zurich. From 1917 onwards, his eyesight began to fail him throughout the 1920s and 30s. He underwent a total of 11 painful eye surgeries. At the time he was writing Finnegan's Wake, a work that defies categorization, he had almost lost his eyesight completely. This tragedy was compounded by the mental breakdown of his daughter in 1932, which resulted in her being treated by Carl Jung. Despite these setbacks, he completed Finnegan's Wake in 1939 and died on January 11th, 1941, less than a month from his 59th birthday. Ulysses is a book that, much like life itself, has no resolution. The novel concludes as Leopold Bloom returns home to his wife Molly and joins her in bed. Molly is given the last chapter of the novel, Penelope. Earlier, Leopold Bloom had mused, "Woman, as easy stop the sea." His wife's soliloquy proves him correct, as it is constantly changing and unbound by conventional punctuation. Like the sea, she is bountiful, at once wife, mother, and lover. Nature it is as for them saying there's no God. I wouldn't give a snap of my 2 fingers for all their learning. Why don't they go and create something, I often asked him. Though she laments the death of her son and the strain it has placed on her marriage, she ultimately affirms her love for Bloom, despite their mutual infidelities, and affirms life itself. I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad, and yes. I said yes, I will, yes.